morning. Thank you so much for those of you who are joining us in person, but also virtually. I think we have about 160 people joining us online, which I think shows the importance of the topic, but also it's a reflection of our amazing panelists. My name is Rebecca Bill Chavez. I'm President and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue, and we are here today to discuss the alarming security crisis in Ecuador. And I think all of you are tracking that Ecuador right now is facing an unprecedented level of violence and turmoil. In fact, I was in Quito just last month for meetings that were hosted by CAF Development Bank of Latin America that brought together members of the Noboa administration and also outside experts to explore innovative ways to address this issue. And I hope we have a chance to talk about some innovative ways today. But before we turn to Ecuador, I just wanted to provide a very brief bit of context, primarily the fact that Ecuador is not alone. Crime and violence are significant challenges across Latin America and the Caribbean. The Americas have the highest regional homicide rate. Sorry, not regional. They have the highest homicide rate in the world, and much of it is related to organized crime. 23% report that they were victims of a crime in the past year, and crime is the top concern of 20% of citizens in the region. It has been and continues to be a primary focus in campaigns across the region, from Mexico to Uruguay. But back to Ecuador. I think that there is a lot to learn from the comparative perspective, which we can, of course, bring into the question and answers. But the dramatic rise of transnational organized crime and illicit trafficking, they've compounded insecurity and really have propelled Ecuador into the ranks of the most violent nations in the hemisphere. In November, Daniel Noboa assumed the presidency, and one of his first actions was to declare a state of internal war and to mobilize not just the national police, but also the armed forces. And of course, this signals the gravity of the situation, but it also has led to considerable debate within Ecuador and beyond about his approach. So today we're going to seek to unravel the complexities behind the security crisis. We're going to examine how Ecuador's institutions are responding to the violence and also explore potential strategies for collaboration with the United States and other partners to overcome the crisis. So to delve into these pressing issues, we really have a just top-notch panel of expert scholars with us. First, we have Dr. Lorena Piedra, Assistant Professor at the Universidad Católica de Ecuador, and also President of the Ecuadorian Association of International Studies. Dr. Piedra is an expert in police intelligence and criminal violence in Ecuador, and she has been a tireless advocate for prison reforms, especially in female wards where violence is rampant. Next, we are joined by Dr. Pablo Andrade, a professor at Universidad Andina. And Dr. Andrade, among other things, has a really deep understanding of the intricate relationship between political parties and criminal violence in Ecuador, something I'm looking forward to hearing about. And finally, we are very privileged to have Dr. Grace Jaramillo, professor at the University of British Columbia and founder of Ecuador's Foreign Policy Forum. Dr. Jaramillo is an expert on Ecuador's foreign policy and international relations more broadly, including in the context of criminal violence. So I think we're going to have lots of time for Q&A today, but I want to get us started. And I want to start with you, Lorena. And my question is, well, it's a request. Could you provide an overview of the current security situation in Ecuador? And also, if you could say a few words about what you see as the major, if there's been progress and also setbacks in the efforts to combat criminal violence, and basically the effectiveness of the policies.
Oh, okay.
That's a big question, I know.
Yeah. That's why I will read a little bit, because I want to be like, I want to say the things I must say and do not go around the ideas. Okay, we have an explosive increase in violent deaths, and this is what characterizes the current scenario in Ecuador. And also there is an endemic conflict within the penitentiary system. And also we have the presence of areas where, as was highlighted in President Noboa's recent state of emergency declaration, the intensity and magnitude of the current situation have exceeded the state's capacities. And what is important is that this criminal violence has a clear origin, and this is an incomplete process of establishing state presence in certain regions of the country. These critical areas include the northern and southern borders, the province of Los Rios, Manabí, and generally hard to reach areas or unlegalized settlements within major cities as Quito and Guayaquil. And the criminal increased violence results from the multiplication of leadership and the struggle among the leaders of criminal organizations. And because we cannot understand this also without the dynamic resulting from broken agreements among political actors linked to organized crime structures. Yeah, we have those elements. And seems like there has been an explicit breakdown of agreements with organized crime structures. And we have also a declaration of war and a lot of improvisations and lack of medium-term plans about what will happen next. And I want to be like brief in this part, but the only progress we have seen is the temporary control of the operational centers of organized crime structures, because they work from inside the prisons. They used to work from there. And we have like a temporary control. But this control is very precarious because the armed forces, which are in charge of this work, said that they are constantly under attack for their current role. And we cannot speak of like progress because there is no medium-term plan in any aspect, not even in the control inside prisons, and also an area that is extremely problematic. It's inside the intelligence system of the country, because there's no way to control what is doing the intelligence system. There hasn't been a way from 2008 till now. We don't have a specialized law in intelligence that allows the assembly of the country to oversight what is going on. And the intelligence system has been doing political intelligence since 2008. And there's no way in which this can prevent to happen all the time. And we have one fact that is very problematic, because right now we have inside Ecuador the same person in charge of the Ministry of El Ministerio del Interior and also of intelligence in the CS. It's the same person. So that's very problematic, because you have the temptation right in front of you of using political intelligence and prioritizing that instead of the knowledge that you need to have in order to prevent the penetration of criminal organizations inside a lot of areas inside the country. And how can I say? That is the worst thing that can happen to a country that wants to prevent the penetration of criminal organizations. You do not have intelligence working as it's supposed to be, and you do not have midterm plans. You don't know what to do next. And what is worse is that the army that used to be the most strong institution inside Ecuador, it's corrupting little by little. And when you don't have the army, what you will do next? You don't have any plan. Maybe it's a short answer.
So much, Lorena. Your point about intelligence is so important because when combating citizen insecurity, I mean, that is perhaps the most important ingredient. So I really appreciated that. And something I hope we can come back to is your point about the military and corrupting the military. We had the chance to talk a little bit before about the dangers of militarization, because once you bring in the military, it's really hard to go back. We've learned a lot from the Mexican case that's been in this role since 2006. And so perhaps we'll find time later to talk about off-ramps for the military, but this idea that the longer the military is involved in this, the more chances there are for human rights abuses and also for corruption. Great points. So one of the things you mentioned was the breakdown of agreements. And Pablo, I want to turn to you here because these political alliances and the rivalries, would love for you to delve into their role in either exacerbating or mitigating criminal violence in Ecuador. And also, because I'm a political scientist too, any insights on the role of political parties in influencing the dynamics?
Well, as a political scientist, I tend to think that in order to explain political phenomena, we need to take into account the structural and institutional factors, yes, but also the role of the parties and the leaders. And also the interaction between those parties and their institutional framework. So to be very succinct, Ecuador's political system, the political institutions, are made for a strong president backed by a majoritarian party in the legislative. And that happened for 10 years. But Correa didn't have the ability to keep the party together once he left office. Once he left office, the party collapsed, in part because of factional rivalries, and that disordered what seems to be, I would love to have more evidence. I only have suspicions at this point. That collapse of Alianza País, with the factors that mentioned Lorena, help the DTOs, the drug trafficking organizations, to first consolidate in the country, and second, to enter into a very dangerous turf war based on their access to basically two changing conditions. One, the European market. We tend to think on the cocaine market, at least as it only comes to, the exports come to the US. But the main consumer of cocaine right now is Europe, right? And Europe, and the market with Europe was favored by a structural change. By institutional change. We signed an agreement, a free trade agreement with Europe, and that helped our exports of cocaine to Europe. So that's one factor. The other factor is that the way in which the political parties operate in our system is really interesting because they are not political parties. They are mere electoral vehicles. If you look at Daniel Noboa party, there's no party. There's no registered legal party at the time when he competed for the election, for his first election. It was a loose alliance, a loose coalition of a series of fragments of former political parties, among them Alianza País. He had no structure. So who is running the country? Because he's now the government. This alliance is the government. Who's running the country? Well, basically, a company. Grupo Noboa, the Noboa Group. If you look at every single one of the ministers, and you look at their CVs, what you're going to see is that they have plenty of experience with management in companies, right? Not so much in politics. So the political system in Ecuador is designed in such a way as you either have the majority unitarian president who is almost dictator, or you don't have support in the legislative and you face defeat very easily. So now those factors are what are playing right now. Let me give you the broad picture once again. You have a very authoritarian, decided president whose only support is not the legislative, because he doesn't have a majority in the legislative. Yes, he has an enormous popularity among the population, as proved by the recent referendum in April, but he doesn't have a political party. He has only a team of managers that he manages as the CEO of a company, right? And his additional support is, of course, the military. Lorena mentioned the militarization of the country. Yeah, it is part of the picture. The other part of the picture is that 6,000 members of the armed forces have asked for early retirement, for getting out of the army and going back to Mexico. If I remember well, the Zetas were more or less in the same dynamic. And going back to Mexico once again, AMLO is an emerging leader, an anti-establishment leader, immensely popular, among other things, because he comes from outside of the party system, supposedly. Well, in the case of Ecuador, if you look at the party system that existed from 1979 to 1997, more or less, there's nothing left. So democracy helps us to kill, to destroy the parties that founded democracy. The only survival is Partido Social Cristiano. And then it came the long years of Rafael Correa and Alianza País, and they supposedly turned to the left. The anti-neoliberal program and so forth and so on, and a new type of involvement with the armed forces, with the police, and so forth and so on. The result has not been cheerful for no one. Well, maybe for those who benefited from it directly. And it seems illegally in some cases. So anyway, and just to wrap up, there are two things that really worries me. The involvement of the military in law enforcement is eroding furthermore our already weak democracy. I don't think that at this point we should talk about Ecuador as a democracy. We should talk about Ecuador as merely a civilian competitive regime. That is what we have in place there. There's a strong tension between the executive and the legislative. And part of the tension is because new elections are right around the corner. And two of the candidates are president, executive, and the president of the legislative. One from the right, Daniel Noboa, and one for the right. One for the right. Mr. What's the name of the president of the legislative? You remember? Conflict, Henry Conflict, member of the Partido Social Cristiano, the party of law and order until yesterday. So there's not much there. One thing that gives me hope, and that it normally tends to be ignored in this type of conversations, is that one really good thing that ironically, Guillermo Lasso, the former president and a former banker, and Daniel Noboa have done is to raise taxes on the wealthiest, on the people who really has money, to fund this war. And that amounts to state building. Now, state building paid by the elites, but led by an authoritarian person, or without a party that is able to control it, without the normal liberal rights to keep in check the power of the state, well, maybe not the way to go. Even the silver line, the silver lining seems to be not that silver, a little bit dark here and there. So we can keep talking about this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you said some very provocative statements there, and I hope we can have time to dive into it. But your part about the party system is not, it's a good one. It's something when we're thinking about democracy more broadly in the region, the erosion of party systems, the link between these disposable parties and the rise of populism, I think is something it's worth exploring. Your statement, I do want to hope we have some time to talk about whether or not Ecuador is still a democracy. I think that you could make a case that it still is. I think of democracy more as a continuum. And I think we see a lot of kind of erosion of democratic institutions in the region. I think I'm a little more optimistic in how I would characterize Ecuador, but I don't live there. But this militarization issue, of course, is real, and it's alarming. The other thing, though, you mentioned AMLO, and I think AMLO is an important reminder that challenges democracy can come from both ends of the political spectrum. They can come from the left and come from the right. And I really just want to put this out there is I think, at least in the United States, policymakers too often think what matters most is the left-right divide and, you know, the return of the pink tide and all of these things, when I think what really matters is the democracy continuum. Are you a liberal democracy, or are you slipping towards authoritarianism? So lots we can discuss on this, but I want to turn.
Sorry. But you just remind me a news that I watched yesterday from Sky News. The headline was, France was, how we lose France to the left.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And it comes, well, Yes, and it comes from both sides sometimes, but the rhetoric here is definitely more along those lines. Okay, Grace, I want to turn to you. And of course, this issue of citizen security, it's an issue that transcends borders. No single country can really address it on its own. I mean, just by its very nature, when we talk about transnational organized crime. So I'm hoping you can shed some light on how Ecuador can develop an even more robust collaborative strategy with the United States, but not just with the United States, with other international partners to effectively address and overcome ultimately the current crisis. And what role do you see international support playing? How can the international community play a productive role?
Thanks for for the invitation, for setting up this panel, because I think there are many ways in which the United States and what I call it the Western Front can help over countries like Ecuador overcome these type of situations. First and foremost, I would say you need a strategy to start with. Ecuador needs a strategy to start with, for starters, I would say. But I mean, talking about the strategy, you also have the capacity to create allies with the United States. I would say the Western front, not only the United States, the European Union, for example, in create such a strategy. But that strategy needs to go beyond just the securitization of the responses. And I mean, since my strength is international political economy, I will just say it right away. You cannot have such a strategy without seizing the moment of the United States of creating value-added employment. Ecuador is, believe it or not, is one of the few countries in the Pacific, at least, that has not inserted itself into global value chains. That is dramatic, something that has been done long ago by El Salvador, by Costa Rica, by even Guatemala. That is not the case of Ecuador, for example. Just neighboring countries, Colombia, Chile, Peru, has been inserting themselves into global value chains. That has twofold consequences. The first is that Ecuador lacks employment, good value-added employment, or at least a steady flow of employment that keeps up with population growth. Just, I will tell you starting data. So 60% of people in Ecuador is under 40 years of age. If you don't create a steady sources of employment, how on earth are you going to overcome the security dilemma that we're now facing? Obviously, the consequences are for all to see. First of all, you have a lot of migration, and irregular or not irregular ones. Value-added migration that stays in the United States or Europe because of better opportunities or just because of the fear of violence. But the second most consequential aspect of that is that the most vulnerable population, especially the ones mentioned by Lorena, in the provinces that are co-opted by criminal violence, Guayas, Esmeraldas, Los Rios, and especially Manabi, that youth is prey to high levels of unemployment, easily co-opted by criminal gangs, to the illegal drug trafficking market. I was telling Rebecca, for example, that one of the also arriving forces into that equation is no longer at least just the coastal region, and that increasingly youth unemployment in vulnerable communities. This is also the Amazon region that is populated by mostly indigenous peoples. A lot of youth unemployed, just, I mean, the regular sources of employment in the Amazon region is usually logging and mining, but even, I mean, those sources of employment, formal employment, can easily cross back and forth to illegal sources of drug trafficking networks that are co-opting also logging and mining opportunities, illegal mining, that is to say. So that is the second aspect where the US can really help not only building a strategy that goes beyond just one administration that hopefully is consensual among different political parties, even the ones that do not support democracy, are party clienteles that really rely on patrimonial distribution of wealth. But the second source is really creating a huge investment in three areas, I would say, answering directly to what Rebecca is expecting. But I really think, and according to other I would say, examples in the region, especially Mexico, now the newly elected president is really focused on negotiating the new free trade agreement, NAFTA 2.0, into nearshoring opportunities. That is a really way to go. It cannot be possible that there is more nearshoring and GVC opportunities in Vietnam than in Latin America. So that is the second aspect. Huge investment in education, in value-added education, in new technologies. Second, investment in startups and I would say accelerators and innovators. And three, huge employment in both areas that can really combat some sort of illegal drug trafficking, but also illegal migration. And I would say that it's not possible that under the circumstances, and this is my advocacy piece, Ecuador just received $27 million a year in development assistance when, the huge crisis that we're witnessing really demands way more.
Thank you. Among other things, I think you brought up a really important issue is I think so many times when we talk about security, there's a bifurcated conversation where I think what you call the securitization of the conversation versus that happens. And then you have the separate conversation on prevention and rehabilitation. These conversations need to be happening together. But I want to give an opportunity to the audience, both those in person and also those of you online, if you want to submit questions. And if you could just introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Sure. Hi, Alejandro Sanchez. I'm an analyst based here in Washington, D.C. A question to the panel. When Quito announced that there was an internal conflict, the groups like the Choneros, the Chone Killers, the Tiburones, they were labeled terrorists. They're no longer criminals, thieves, murderers, they're terroristas. What's your opinion about that? What's your opinion about and how does that affect, I guess, from a legal perspective, to be charged with terrorism as compared to not being charged for being a drug trafficker? I'm sure there's a worse penalty or a time in prison, but what do you think about the fact that the Ecuadorian government is now using that label to describe these entities? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just two very quick questions. One is, I think, the elephant in the room in this crisis, and it is Colombia. I would like to know your opinion if there is any connection about the present security crisis in Colombia and the fact that there is a total collapse of the fighting against narcotics in Colombia and also of the border security, of the Colombian border security capabilities, particularly in the southern part of the country. Basically, I am going to be a little bit an overstatement, but basically Ecuador is no longer limiting with Colombia, it's limiting with a group, a set of different criminal gangs, dissident groups, and so on and on. So that's my first issue. The second issue is a little bit more, the second question is a little bit more about the comparison with Mexico. Yes, I would like to go a little bit deeper about this issue because I think there are a couple of very important differences between Ecuador and Mexico regarding the role of the military in public security. A couple of things. One is the Ecuadorian military is much smaller. We are talking really about that really small force. We are talking about the army's around 25,000 troops, more or less. The second thing is, excuse me? In Ecuador, yeah. well, this is not the figure I have. Maybe you are right, but the other thing is Ecuador has a really strong national police, at least in terms of numbers. And this is very different in comparison with Mexico. So there is a kind of balance on the side of the law enforcement, in the sense that, I mean, it's not like Mexico now with just just the military running almost completely the public security. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Daniel from the Rule of Law program at the Dialogue. Just a comment and a question. I think that sometimes we forget that this government is the result of, the cross-state mechanism, like muerte cruzada. It only had like 1 year right now. And we're also in a pre-electoral context, because we know that next year we're going to have like presidential elections. So sometimes we feel that when we talk about security in Ecuador, we're asking too much to a government that only has right now, a temporary government. And sometimes we think on long-term measures that will attack the root causes of violence, but those long-term measures takes a lot of time to implement. So my question is like, what do you think could be some of the short-term measures that we can implement right now to fight, security? And then maybe we can think on medium and long-term measures like social policies, education, investment. But right now, if we can, think about something to provide some security to Ecuadorians, what those measures can be. I know it's not an easy question, so.
Miguel Diaz, retired. I think my question is along the same lines. I mean, I didn't hear much about sequencing in terms of dealing with this issue. I personally think talking about value added party system is really secondary to the immediate task of providing some kind of security stability in the country. So the question then becomes, what do you have to work with? And from what I heard, there really isn't a lot. You have a military, which is somewhat controversial, but at least it's a military. They have uniforms, they have some kind of training, they have some kind of capability. I have, if I were a citizen of Ecuador, I wouldn't have a problem with relying on whoever has the capacity to actually do something. Which brings me to my question. I do think intelligence is important, and it's made a big difference in Colombia and in Mexico, to the extent that they had, in the case of Colombia, they had their own intelligence capability developed during many years of fighting, which was very easy to work with when the U.S. decided to work with the Colombians back in the institution centers created types of coalescing of intelligence capabilities that I think made a I do wonder whether Ecuador has the institutional capability to work with the U.S. and the nitty-gritty issues of dealing with security, military bases. Any reflections you could provide on that?
For I think 4 excellent questions, difficult questions. And so why don't we go in the order that you spoke, and you could kind of pick which one you think you're most equipped to answer.
Well, I will try to. Okay. Why call organized crime organization terrorists? I think that was like the quick strategy in order to let the military get into the subject, because with the Ecuadorian constitution, we have like very straight lines that allows or not the military get into this kind of conflict. And before the last referendum that we had, it was like that you needed a special situation in order to let the military get inside the prisons all the time. Yeah. One of the things. And how can I say? It's not possible to say this openly, in Ecuador to talk about these things as a result of polarization, because the style of government has authoritarian traits. And it's amazing that even that we have a context in where criminal leaders like Fito, leader of the Choneros, and Colon Pico, that it's the operational leader of the Lobos, and he's responsible for the threats against the Attorney General. They remain free, although they escaped from jail. Yeah, and we have that situation, and we lack of a professional intelligence and centralized system that is working. So that's a big issue that we have to fix inside the country in order to have real capabilities of doing something. We must, what we must do immediately in order to fix this situation, first of all, we must get rid of improvisation inside the security field. Why? Because we have this big issue that it's the penetration of organized crime into key states institutions, yeah? And the integration between corruption and organized crime has been so successful due to symbiosis with corrupt actors. Evidence of this can be seen inside the slide, that it's the institution responsible for the penitentiary system. We have this prison that is Chillogallo inside Quito, and you can imagine a prison that it's special for pregnant women and breastfeeding children that have the right to live with their moms since they have, until they have like 3 years old. And also women with terminal illnesses, this prison used to guarantee the basics for the children, but since 2023, this had turned to the opposite, because on December of 2023, we have a key witness that was a corrupt functionary, and she was the one, a public official involved in a criminal structure that used to control the justice system. And she was transferred to this prison by judicial decision, and her presence has disrupted the dynamics of the children that are inside the prison, and that in practical terms are locked up with their mothers. So they are like inside, dentro de los pabellones, they are locked up starting at 4 p.m. every day, and the children are just allowed to go out at 8 a.m. every single day. And you have overcrowded conditions, 20 mothers and children per pavilion, and they have like maybe between 13 hours or 15 hours of confinement every single day. Imagine like toddlers, babies, and this leads to physical, psychological, and sexual violence. In this context, the children barely receive the required caloric intake, because, you know, inside Ecuador prisons, the state is not paying anymore for food. So the only food the people has inside, it comes from donations from civil society. And the authorities are improvising almost all the time inside intelligence, inside a prison system, and they rarely last a year in their roles. You don't have professionals doing intelligence or the work inside prisons, and they lack the knowledge and experience to make it work. And that's what we must fix, because you don't have professionals working in the most serious parts that you have, that you must work in order to fix this problem.
Thanks for sharing that, by the way. That was, wow.
Well, I'd like to deepen a little bit my comparison with Mexico. It may look even awkward. I mean, if you look at the size of Mexico, the size of Ecuador, there's almost no comparison. If you look at the economic structure of Mexico, how diversified is it? How dependent is it from the United States, but also how competitive is it in worldwide terms? And you look at the economic structure in Ecuador, there's no comparison. Basically, what we export is shrimp, oil, tomatoes, and exotic fruits. Well, chocolate, very good one, by the way, the best of the world. Anyway, but if you look at the strategy, then the comparison makes sense. Why? Because the strategy of Calderon during the war of drugs was basically to target the criminal organizations and to decapitate the leadership. That is exactly the same strategy in Ecuador. And it's working more or less like in Mexico. That is failing. And I don't have to say it. You know, some of my statements may seem polemic. They are not. You only have to read Decree 381 of July 2 this year, 2024, which it's a very hard to read document, but when you read it, it is actually a confession signed by the president of how the strategy is working. So how the strategy is working, according to the sources quoted by the president, that is an extraordinary document. It says, according to those sources, that more or less, approximately 11,000 people have died in the past 4 years. 11,000 people killed. 92% of them men. 89% of them killed by a firearm, by a gun or a pistol, you know? And there's another interesting comparison between Ecuador and Mexico. In Mexico, the gentleman is right. In Mexico, the military were the dominant force, right? And that was because in Mexico, among other things, you have, I don't remember how many, but too much fragmentation between the police. Yeah, the law enforcement forces are, you pick up this iPad and there's an agent of the law enforcing, you know, the police, the law. Well, anyway, in Ecuador, we have only one national police. It is centrally commanded and so forth and so on. But in the new situation, we have, as part of the strategy, a new special force called Bloque de Seguridad. The Bloque de Seguridad is a coordination between the armed forces, the army especially, and the national police. It goes up to extremes. For example, up to 2 weeks ago when you were there, the president ordered the joint command of the armed forces and the police to operate in order to make sure that the Bloque de Seguridad operates as it's supposed to be. They ordered to move it physically from Quito to Manta, where the Bloque de Seguridad was operating. Now, if you look at the structure of the Bloque de Seguridad, normally who's in charge is a general of the army, not of the police. And to make things even clearer, in that same decree that I just quote, right? One of the justifications, one of the legal justifications for the decree is that we need to improve the coordination between the army and the police. But it is clear also that the police is subject, is inferior. It should be coordinated by the army because the army is supposed to be less contaminated, right? Yesterday, the Minister of Interior, Monica Plasencia, Palencia, yeah. Monica Palencia, she said that in Guayas, which is the first murderous district of the country, right? 145 per 1,000 in some areas of homicides, homicide rate, will be commanded, the bloque de seguridad will be commanded by a general of the army, and the general of the army will be the official spokesperson and so forth and so on. So, I disagree with you, my dear friend, that I just met, but anyway, you're dear to me. With the things that parties are not important. Maybe I misunderstand you. But elections are important. So in 2025, we're going to have an election, right? And that election is going to be, once again, disputed by two loose coalitions, 2 or 3 or maybe 24, because the electoral law in Ecuador is very loose, of electoral machines, right? And it's beginning to show. Once again, go back to the decree 381. The decree is supposed to focalize, to target some provinces, among them Guayas, Manabí, well, no Esmeraldas, actually, because in Esmeraldas, we don't have an emergency according to the decree. But according to the decree, right, those provinces are the major electoral districts. So you are going to have an election under military rule, under military law. If I remember well, that doesn't sound like a democracy. There may be electoral competition among civilians. That's so weird, the Nazis.
Yes. So really quickly, I just wanted to say really upfront. So we were hoping to have a representative of the Ecuadorian embassy today, and it ended up falling through. I think it would have been really helpful to have that. But I do want to if it's okay, just interject very quickly, because I think Danielle, and your question about sequencing was really important. Because what are the other tools? And I think this one of the things we've learned from Bukele and El Salvador are people are willing to sacrifice a lot in exchange for security. So what other options did Noboa have? Does Noboa have? If the military is the only option, okay, if it's in the short term and if it's what citizens demand, it's worth, I think we have to think about that, that. I have a hard time with this sometimes because I've been very critical of Bukele's approach, but we actually have a woman in the room who was just there, who's Salvadoran, who came back and just talked about the impact on her family. So, but on this, I think what's the danger, part of the danger, I served in the Obama administration in the Pentagon, and is what is the off-ramp for the military? Because one of the challenges of Mexico is we've seen, and this is a Mexico case, which there are important differences, is that once you start relying on the military, it takes away the incentive to strengthen the police. So Peña Nieto and the Gendarmerie, the National Guard was supposed to do it. So something for us to think about as we think about the best ways. We have to come up with a framework for addressing citizen security that's within a rule of law framework. I think this question of off-ramps for the military is going to be key. And so what we did under the Obama administration, I'm not going to say it worked, in part because there wasn't continuity of government, but I think in part because maybe this wasn't clear enough, is that continued military assistance was dependent on having a viable off-ramp for the military in the issue of law enforcement. But the sequencing effort and what else is there available in the short run, these are, as much as these are issues we have to grapple with.
But I was going to really point that out, Rebecca, precisely because we just published alongside my friend Max Cameron last year, Challenges to Democracies in the Andes. So we actually did a comparative study of what is going on with horizontal controls of democracy and what is happening with the state structures within the Andes. And it is clear for us all that one of the problems and tackling, for example, the issue about intelligence, something that Lorena is working right now, but I worked before, and trying to really call attention to the different administrations in Ecuador of the real need to create an intelligence structure that has democratic controls. So what you now have, and I mean, it used to be better actually. Ecuador used to have a good criminal intelligence that used to work alongside its Colombian counterparts. That broke down in 2008, and I was part of the process, I mean, the academic liaison to make those two get together back again. So that was the difference. That was what has changed so much regarding intelligence since 2008, after Angostura, after the I would say the situation between Colombia and Ecuador, they stopped sharing intelligence for criminal activity or against criminal activities. So Ecuador replaced that with some sort of political intelligence as opposed to criminal intelligence. The government needs to have an agreement to go back again and to have a new system where the center is intelligence against criminal activity, against international crime, against cybersecurity crime also, but also with democratic controls. Why we are inserting the issue of Mexico into the whole comparison examination in this case is because Mexico was the one kind of penetrating the criminal gangs in Ecuador, not Colombia. I mean, that is sort of an important information. And we are advocating now, and that is why these type of forums are super important also for Ecuador and the possibilities of American collaboration and Western collaboration with Ecuador in fighting insecurity, is because it goes beyond just one administration. Yes, indeed, Daniel Noboa is just 6 months, probably 8 months now into the presidency, but a strategy is key to have some sort of consensual or democratic agreement between the parties that goes beyond one single administration. And it starts to reassert control of what to do with the military afterwards, for example, how the coordination should work between the agents of the state. And something that we miss out in this discussion is how independent is the justice system from both the criminal activities and also single administrations targeting political paybacks, for example. So that is key for all the success and the success of any approach to combat increasing criminality, increasing violence in Ecuador in the future, in the near future, in the medium term, in the long term.
I think I want to give chance for another round, and also if there are any pressing questions that are coming in. So I think if we have time for another round. Oh, so we have one there and one over on this end of the room.
Hi, and thank you again very much for being here. This is very interesting. It's great to hear your voices on the topic. Very important. My name is James Virgil. I would like to start with a comment and then follow up with a question here. The comment is that we've been comparing the Ecuadorian situation a lot to the Colombian and Mexican ones. And I think that although there is some purpose to that, it's a limit on the utility of these comparisons. Ecuadorian situation is primarily a narco trafficking one and not a narco producing or distributing one that we would see in Mexico or Colombia. And therefore, the Band-Aid solutions that we could say probably weren't very effective and are not very effective in Mexico and Colombia, who knows how they would apply to the Ecuadorian situation? Which leads me to my question. With that caveat, it has been shown, Tom Wainwright is a great economist who gets into this, that higher walls mean higher ladders. As militarization and counter-narcotics increases, narco organizations militarize in turn. Do you think that there is room in the Ecuadorian narcotics, counter-narcotics conflict for a demilitarization starting on the government's part to make a more peaceful conflict resolution?
Morning, I'm Emily Cole. I work as an attorney and researcher with the program on global faith and inclusive societies out of Pepperdine's DC campus. My question for you, we focus on human rights broadly, but mostly international religious freedom. So it's a little bit of a different question, but I just wanted to ask, do you have an opinion or see the role for faith leaders in some of these communities, especially like Esmeraldas or Manabi, areas where, like you said, there's low employment opportunities and it's probably more at the local level where things can take root. So I guess I'm just wondering, I know your backgrounds are varied, political science, economics, but do you see a larger role for faith communities, whatever they may be, to act as sort of catalysts to help with security and stability, especially given that the OAS General Assembly, one of their resolutions noted specifically that religious freedom is one of those pathways towards stability and democracy in many different countries in the region. So thank you.
More, Peter McPherson in the front row. Wait, let's get you a microphone.
Thank you so very much for comments. And it seems like you do an excellent job indicating the problem, but we haven't really gotten into as much of what would be proposed to do now. It's clear that security and crime is a major issue in Ecuador to the population. And it's also clear historically that sooner or later when those issues are so great, then a person on horseback arrives and takes control of things. So I know we're about out of time, but as I sit here listening to this with long association and great affection for Ecuador, I'm particularly interested in what you would say today or the months ahead would be the best course or our options for courses for the Ecuadorians to take to deal with this problem.
Question. So why don't we this time, we'll start and we'll go this direction. So Grace, why don't we start with you?
Great. So I will resume my conversation with Peter because Peter was just asking me that at the beginning of the of this event. I would do two things mainly. One, a good strategy that focuses on creating good intelligence against criminal activity, connecting that intelligence system with democratic controls that exist in other democracies. Two, I will definitely invest in anchor companies, in an anchor industry that lifts immediately a lot of people out of poverty, creates huge levels of employment in some sort of area. Other than that, I mean, there are so many things to do, but I will start with those two.
Thank you, Grace.
Keeping with Grace's spirit and your question, I think that the way to go is to strengthen civil society along with these other efforts. Indeed, we need better intelligence. Indeed, but we also need more democracy, more democratic controls on them, because otherwise we're going to end up in the same sorry state that we were under Correa. And yeah, to go back to you, faith communities are part of the picture. There should be. Actually, I will suggest you to look at work that the Combonianos, I don't know what's the name in English, one order of the Catholic Church, are doing in Esmeraldas. Amazing stuff. Really, really, really interesting. And what the thing that that they are doing is actually putting together indirect action, you know, face to face, the military with their organization, right? Because under the state of emergency, and I know that some things are well, we have to do something. Under the military law, under the emergency law, the military can go right into your house and take you as suspected of drug trafficking, belonging to a gang, or being a killer, or you know, whatever. But if you are a woman, and if you are captured by a peloton or by a patrol of the army, well, your prospects are dire. So what is this person doing? Well, he organizes the barrio, the neighborhood, good people, by the way, to accompany this woman to the prison, to the military barracks, and being sure that she is well, and that she comes out well. There's growing concerns of human rights. And one of the most motivated civil society organizations that are following these human rights abuses comes from the Catholic Church, comes from the progressive evangelical churches that are working in Ecuador. So yeah, I think it's part of the picture, and a very important part of the picture.
Can I just say that you said that your question might not be relevant. I think it was incredibly relevant in this point. So Pablo and I were speaking beforehand about having these conversations need to be inclusive, and civil society is such an important voice that needs to be at the table. I think we're running out of time. So I want to give Lorena a chance. And then of course, those of you who are available, we can stay around and we can chat afterwards.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Talking about the role of religious actors inside Ecuador, la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador just last year opened a big campus in Esmeraldas, and in the most dangerous places in which no one wants to have a place. For example, in San Lorenzo, yeah, you have a small campus, but you have one. And in other places in Esmeraldas that the things are going on very bad. And this is unique because the university has special scholarships for people in risk. And this is important because if you think it twice, this is not work of one private university, one Catholic university. This is work of the state to offer opportunities to study to a lot of people there. Yeah, and I also I want to add something. Talking about the intelligence capabilities in Ecuador, something that it's impossible to think as a possibility, but that happens in Ecuador is that the government and the strategy of the government is not seeing that organized crime structures inside Ecuador have diversified their income generation lines, including timber trafficking and the highly lucrative illegal gold extraction. The Lobos had become very strong in this. And here we have a very rare fact. The authorities does not have the numbers of how many million of dollars can earn the Lobos by illegal gold extraction. Yeah, some analysts says $2 million per month. Some other analysts can make the numbers climb till maybe $10 million a month. So you don't have the numbers and you are not seeing this problem, but this ensures that the operational capability of criminal organizations in the context of an internal war change. So it does not matter if drugs, trafficking, or extraction systems are attacked. They have a financial caution. And no one is seeing this inside Ecuador. Illegal mining is the most lucrative income line right now and the least attacked by the state structures, which are almost exclusively focused on drugs. And this is how can I say, a real danger that we have, because no institution inside the country has the exact numbers of what's going on.
Well, thank you all. Grace, I just wanted to say one comment on your two suggestions. And just, so when we were in Quito for this workshop with members of the administration, maybe you were channeling me, because I think the two of the key pieces of not advice, but kind of the workshop focused on is, one is developing a short-term, long-term, medium-term strategy. And the second one was intel. But I wanted to end by bringing this back to, I think, a theme that has been kind of, especially with you, Pablo, this theme of democracy, because I think this topic of security has huge implications for democracy in the region, and not just Ecuador, because I think this issue of how finding ways to address citizen insecurity within a rule of law framework is really important when it comes to addressing the crisis of confidence in democracy. I think you're all tracking that over the past 2 decades, the decline in support for democracy. Today, only 3 in 5 citizens of the region see democracy as the best form of government, and even probably more alarming is only 2 in 5 are satisfied with how it performs. And one of the reasons is this government providing me, can my kids go to school? So when we're thinking about how to build support for democracy at a time when we're seeing erosion of democratic institutions across much of the hemisphere, addressing citizen insecurity is one way. And finally, I just want to announce that we are going to be, we have an annual conference every year with CAF Development Bank and the Organization of American States. This year, it's going to be on September 5th at the OAS, and the focus of the conference is going to be on security and development. So we'll have the opportunity, and definitely, I think the conversation we had today will feed into it. So I want to thank you, Lorena, Pablo, and Grace, so much for being here, and thank you to our audience here and online for joining us.